We're here to discuss the American Revolution. And does it seem strange to you to hear that an Attleboro man came this close to starting the American Revolution 10 days before Lexington and Concord? Is that conceivable? It really happened. And we'll talk about that today. Well, as you all know, on April 19th of 1775, armed American patriots north of Boston, alerted by Paul Revere's legendary ride, confronted British redcoats in the battles of Lexington and Concord. They would touch off the American Revolution and a long conflict that would eventually result, years later, in the American victory at Yorktown, Virginia, and the birth of the United States of America, the country that we love. But it was not the first incident of armed conflict between Americans and the British or their sympathizers, far from it. And in one case, a group of patriots led by an Attleboro revolutionary and militia leader that might easily have started the revolution off 10 days earlier. Now, Colonel John Daggett's a name you've probably heard before, at the head of more than 1,000 armed volunteers, won a bloodless American victory after surprising a small body of British armed and supplied loyalist troops on April 10th in the town of Freetown, just east of Taunton. That military action might have been even more consequential had the British landed actual redcoats as had been expected and in fact was planned by General Gage. As it turned out, about 30 Tory volunteers, hopelessly outnumbered, were taken prisoner. But Daggett and his men would continue to play a part in the Revolution in Rhode Island and New York, as well as Massachusetts. More about Daggett, his men, and their bold expedition later. The fact is that the conflict in Lexington and Concord was not the first violent clash between the Patriots and the British or their American sympathizers. Beginning with the so-called Boston Massacre in 1770, there are other confrontations where shots were exchanged and blood was shed in places such as Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and on Narragansett Bay. On March 5, 1770, 7 British soldiers fired into a crowd in Boston in what we would now call a violent demonstration. 5 people were killed, 5 patriots were killed. The event, known as the Boston Massacre, grew out of increasing tensions between American colonists and the British government. The event was symptomatic of a growing distance, both political and economic, between Britain and its colonies. In the 1760s, England had been embroiled in the European War for 7 years, appropriately called the 7 Years' War. That war cost England plenty, resulting in a ballooning budget and a doubling of the national debt. Somehow, Britain would have to find the money to pay for it. Now, to do so, Parliament wanted to increase taxes on the colonies in the form of higher duties, tariffs, familiar word, on imports as well as other means. Higher taxes and tighter restrictions on trade angered the colonists and prompted increasing violence in America and in Boston particularly. That, in turn, caused the British to send soldiers to occupy the town beginning in 1768. That's Boston, not Attleboro. But there had been even earlier provocations, some here in southeastern Massachusetts. For instance, the Sugar Act in 1764 increased the duties, tariffs, on molasses, which were a staple commodity in those days. The result, naturally, molasses smuggling. The following year, the sloop Polly, which you see here, set out from probably the West Indies, loaded with barrels and barrels of molasses. It eventually arrived on the Taunton River, where the ship tied up in southern Taunton. No duties having been paid, British authorities seized the ship. This, of course, displeased the consignees and their friends who were determined to do something about it. In the middle of the night, it was reported, a number of men with their faces blackened appeared and, unknown to British authorities, carried off all the barrels. Now, the Brits found little to no cooperation from the locals in finding the molasses thieves. And that made the colonists' triumph all the sweeter, no pun intended. Now, I want to ask you this question. Now, I'm old enough to remember when my mother would buy a jar of molasses, sweet molasses, for me as a 6-year-old to spread on crackers or on toast or bread or something. That's kind of a substitute for ring-dings, I guess. But making sweets and snacks is hardly the only reason for molasses. Does anybody have an idea what else you would be using that much molasses for? Rum. Because what do you get when you boil down molasses and distill it? You get rum. And the Boston area was notorious for making some of the cheapest, wateriest rum around. So cheap that that was preferred by almost babies, almost mother's milk to the colonists in those days because it was so cheap. So that was the sloop Polly and the theft of the molasses in the middle of the night in the port of Taunton. Now, increased taxes and duties on the colonies and the quartering of British soldiers were just the start. You've heard of the Stamp Act, which was enacted in 1765, that required Americans to purchase stamps to be affixed to all kinds of papers, legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, and others. The Stamp Act, hated and a source of protest by colonists, would be repealed 2 years later. However, Parliament wasn't through. In 1767, the Townshend Acts imposed a whole new bevy of taxes on imports, and including lead and glass. As you can imagine, the enactment of punitive import duties and taxes increasingly got under the skin of Americans, and particularly those of Massachusetts residents in whose territory redcoats were now quartered in the town of Boston. The Intolerable Acts, which included the closing of the port of Boston, ramped up ill feeling even more. Now, the unavailability of the port of Boston complicated the transport of goods, including both imports and exports, which inflicted hardships on residents and businesses and were viewed as something not far short of the Spanish Inquisition by the New England colonists. And this feeling was shared intensely by those in southeastern Massachusetts, who felt as put upon as those in Boston. This doesn't mean our area was devoid of those loyal to the king, however. And it made for sometimes violent conflict between area patriots and loyalists, who would be forever henceforth referred to as Tories. This conflict would be felt intensely in the Taunton and Attleboro areas, and with violent results. Patriot feeling rose so high against the crown that in 1774, Taunton, then as now the county seat, patriots shut down the colonial courts there and evicted the magistrates who had been sitting in the courthouse. Daniel Leonard, a Norton native, prominent Taunton resident, was a member of the General Court in those days and very close to British General Thomas Gage, who was then acting for all intents and purposes of governor of Massachusetts colony. In 1774, as tensions continued to rise, Gage appointed the Tory Leonard to the governor's council. Well, when local patriots found out, that means men and women from Attleboro, from Taunton, from throughout Bristol County, they got together and 500 of them mobbed Leonard's home on Taunton Green, where the Superior Court building now stands. Amid violent threats, several shots were fired through Leonard's windows. Faced with imminent danger, Leonard removed his family to Boston. Independence was not yet an expressed goal of patriots in America, though it was certainly on the minds of many. But if there was any doubt about the spirit of defiance they felt, it was becoming increasingly clear. A visible symbol soon appeared in the town of Taunton. On October 21st, 1774, there was displayed in town a new flag, and not the British Union Jack either. It was a bright red flag with a small representation of the Union Jack in one corner. Across the red field were embroidered the words in white, "Liberty" and "Union." The flag, inspired by the Reverend Caleb Brown, was intended as a dissent to British rule, though not necessarily separation from Great Britain. Ironically, patriots raised the flag on a 110-foot pole they located right next to the Tory Leonard's house. Many consider that the first American flag. Copies of the flag are still being made and sold today. Now, as we have said, on April 19, 1775, a small force of patriots faced off against British troops on Lexington Green in a deadly confrontation that would open the war for American independence. But the violence that erupted in Lexington and nearby Concord wasn't the single match that touched off the explosion of the American Revolution. In fact, the level of violence had been building from the previous summer, when tightening repression by King George III turned colonists' resentment of British rule into a fury. The unstoppable march toward independence had begun, and part of it would pass through Attleboro. Long before General Thomas Gage's troops came face to face with the Minutemen on Lexington Green, patriots were already in a fighting mood. 1772, Rhode Island patriots demonstrated their contempt for restrictions on colonial trade by burning a British customs vessel off the coast of Rhode Island. That was the revenue cutter Gaspee, whose green British lieutenant, who was in command, ran her aground. Well, that led to a raid on the vessel by John Brown of the future Brown University and his brothers, and they burned that ship to the waterline. By 1774, conflict had reached an even higher pitch in response to British laws, closing the port of Boston and extinguishing the colonists' rights to self-government. Response was immediate. In Worcester that year, more than 4,000 militiamen thronged the center of town and forcefully threw out the British magistrates from the courts. Outside British-occupied Boston, royal authority was virtually nullified in the colony of Massachusetts. James Hollister, a National Park Service ranger based in Lexington, told me years ago, the escalating violence was a reaction to the Intolerable Acts, series of strict resolves by the British Parliament, and the dissolution of the colonial legislature by Gage. Patriots responded by reconvening the General Court in the name the Provincial Congress and claiming sole government authority in defiance of the Crown. As of October 1774, Massachusetts was in open revolt against the Crown in everything but name. Once you had the Intolerable Acts, it was no longer a political struggle, Hollister said. People became convinced the conspiracy theories they had been hearing about British intentions to crush the rights of Americans were true. Enraged, a patriot force in December 1774 attacked a fort in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, defended by loyalist colonial troops. A scant force of defenders was overwhelmed after firing their cannon at the mob and engaging in brief hand-to-hand combat. Then the rebels carried off the fort's stores of gunpowder and weapons for later use. Things would get worse, and very soon. This was a complicated period, said Peter Drummey of the Massachusetts Historical Society. It's not the case of a single event that by itself started the revolution. It was a series of incidents. Observing all this was Colonel John Daggett, an Attleboro surveyor and patriot, as well as a local militia and political leader. Daggett served on the Revolutionary Attleboro Committee of Correspondence and was a signer of Attleboro's Solemn League and Covenant, a provocative document that pledged to boycott British goods in protest over the closing of the Boston port. Now, Daggett was a militant member along with Lieutenant Moses Brown. Yes, Wilmot Street is named for him. And he was, along with several other patriots, he was a member of the Committee of Safety formed for the purposes of defense of the town. Daggett, who was a prestigious member of the community, was also named to represent Attleboro in the General Court. No less determined, but on the other side of things, was Colonel Thomas Gilbert, a veteran of the French and Indian Wars who remained loyal to the king. Gilbert, his in-laws, and like-minded friends made up the nucleus of pro-British sentiment in their stronghold in Freetown in Berkeley, just east of Taunton. Daggett and Gilbert, both military men, and their respective adherents had already demonstrated their intentions and capacity to use violence. In the town of Berkeley, just outside of Taunton, loyalists had taken to knocking down so-called liberty poles erected by patriots with banners attached symbolizing revolutionary spirit. Unfortunately for two of their number, a group of patriots caught up to them and had them tarred and feathered. Just a terrible fate. Fortunately, that punishment went out in the 18th century. Now, a year earlier, 1774, Daggett had led an armed detachment to march on the house of loyalist Franklin merchant Nathan Aldous, who reportedly was dealing in British merchandise contrary to a boycott established by the General Court. At gunpoint, Aldous agreed to no longer sell British goods. According to contemporary sources, Gilbert recruited 100 or more loyalist militia members, having obtained arms and military supplies from General Gage. Word leaked out, and by March 1775, Patriot firebrands in the Taunton-Attleboro area, as well as neighboring towns and surrounding Bristol County, deemed the Tory leader a legitimate threat. In response to clashes between Patriots and his loyalists, Gilbert reportedly asked Gage to send British reinforcements, actual redcoats. Gage, it is written, ordered a detachment of 200 British redcoats to reinforce the area, reinforce Gilbert. Robert Treat Payne, prominent Taunton lawyer, future signer of the Declaration of Independence, by the way, brought the matter to Congress's attention, and Congress in return advised local patriots to keep a close eye on Gilbert, but to take no action to provoke violence. They wanted the British to strike first. But in early April, patriots received reports that Gilbert had left town and strongly suspected he would soon return with a squadron of British troops. Local militia officials and volunteers decided on a preemptive strike, set April 9th as the date. Now, it's 10 days before Lexington. Daggett is placed in command. It was 10 days before the fateful shot heard around the world. Patriot attackers were well supplied. Heads of households in those days had firearms at the ready, which were used for hunting or defense. Colonists drew powder and stores from a circular powder house they had constructed in 1768, and which still stands today off Mount Hope Street in North Attleboro. A news item published in the Providence Gazette on April 22nd, 1775 explains what happened next. A letter from Taunton, dated last Friday, mentions that on Monday before, parties of Minutemen, etc., from every town in that county, with arms and ammunition, met at Freetown that morning in order to take Colonel Gilbert. But he had fled on board the frigate HMS Rose, a man of war at Newport. Contemporary sources say a force of as many as 2,000 militiamen and Minutemen were involved in the raid. There's no account of any shooting. Patriot forces did take 29 loyalist recruits prisoner, seizing 35 muskets and other military stores. The captives were marched off to Taunton, where most were released after quote-unquote humble acknowledgments of their past conduct. About a dozen more defiant recruits were threatened with imprisonment, but they backed down. They were later released. Just over a week later, the collision between British and American forces at Lexington and Concord would turn the incipient rebellion into a shooting war. With the revolution underway, Daggett continued in his role as a military figure commanding the 4th Bristol County Regiment. Soldiers under his command, some of whom had been involved in the Freetown raid, continued to serve the new country through most of the war. Daggett continued to be a revered figure long after the Revolution. His brother and fellow Revolutionary veteran Napthal, by the way, served briefly as president of Yale University. John Daggett died in 1803 and is buried, along with his wife, not even a short walk from here in the Old Kirk Cemetery in Attleboro. A nearby memorial pays tribute to the town's revolutionary heroes. Loyalists reviled in the wake of independence, less celebrated. Gilbert fled after the Freetown raid and would remain a Tory. He and families of his in-laws and friends who had supported the Loyalist cause would suffer later, being dispossessed of their property and exiled to New Brunswick in Canada. Gilbert was granted land in the Canadian province for his loyal service to King George. He died in 1796. Today, the Rehoboth Minute Company reenacts the role of the original unit for parades and living history demonstrations. Originally chartered in 1774, the company was a mixed force of 210 militia and Minutemen in 1775, commanded by Daggett and Colonel Timothy Parker of Rehoboth. 10 days after the Freetown raid, according to the unit's website, the company was ordered to Roxbury and Dorchester. Many members of the unit eventually served in the Continental Army following a reorganization of the military in 1776. Later, under Colonel Thomas Carpenter, the remainder of the company took part in the battles of White Plains, Battle of Rhode Island, in Yonkers, and Long Island. Local militia force remained an active military unit until 1840, when it was formally disbanded. Reminders of those from Attleboro who served in the Revolution are scattered throughout the town to this day. Names of revolutionary heroes or their families are memorialized in street names such as Sweet, Richardson, Thatcher, Tiffany, Claflin, and Capron. The Ebenezer Peck House, the birth home of the Revolutionary veteran, still exists today and is the headquarters of the Daughters of the American Revolution in Attleboro. Many of those from the Revolutionary era are buried in the Kirkyard Cemetery behind Second Congregational Church, which, as I said, is barely a short walk from where we now stand. The first row of graves just behind the church, intended as a place of honor, are located the flag-decorated resting places of Colonel John Daggett and his wife Mercy, both symbols of American independence, democracy, and liberty and justice for all. Thank you for your attention today. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about Attleboro and the Revolution.